So, David, a lot of the work that you've done over the course of your career has been on drylands. How would you define drylands?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I think we've traditionally tended to define dry lands uh, based on climate. So landscapes that are semi-arid or arid, meaning they kind of get less than about 500 millimeters or what's that, 20 inches of rainfall. Um, they're generally hot. Um, but, our kind of thinking about dry lands has changed a little bit over the last few decades, and we're thinking um, that there's also a human aspect to drylands, what makes a landscape a dryland. But in general, they're generally not cultivated. They're generally rangelands, we might say, or grazing lands or forestry. Um, so you can kind of look at drylands through different lenses, but essentially they're landscapes that are quite harsh, um, that support 40% of the Earth's population, occur over nearly 40% of the terrestrial landscape of the planet. Um, and there are areas where there's a lot of conflict. There's a lot of poor people. There's a lot of warfare. There's a lot of fighting over water. They're pretty exciting landscapes.
What's the big misconception you think people have around them, or what's changed maybe throughout the course of your career in terms of how people view drylands?
I think I think this kind of touches on the term desertification or degradation. And we've tended to think of drylands uh, as climatically driven. So they're dry because there's not enough rainfall, or it's too hot, or the evaporation is greater than the precipitation. But really, like I said before, there's a human element, and humans humans are one of the big drivers of drylands. They overgraze, they overcultivate where they shouldn't, they cut firewood, they do a lot of things that cause landscapes that probably weren't drylands, 1,000 years ago, to move into what we might call drylands now, these sort of fairly fragile, degraded, semi-arid and arid systems.
Are you a proponent of theories like Alan Savory has, where you can regenerate drylands, bring them back to a more pastoral state through human interaction in a positive way?
Well, I don't see what Alan Savory does as particularly positive. There's a lot of debate about Savory and his what's it? What's the term? I can't remember now.
Holistic management.
Oh yeah, well, the changes that it was holistic resource management, then it was holistic management, now it's something else. Um, I think, oh, look, we could talk for ages about the Savory system, but there there are some good things about holistic management, um, and that is take care of the land, look after the land, think about what your family wants, plan for the future, look at the ecology. But there's also a lot of things about the savory system that are damaging, that you can double your stocking rate and earn more money, that you've got to beat the crap out of the soil because the soil crust is halting succession. There's a lot of misconception about savory, and um, I think that when Savory appeared on the TED Talks, that created a lot of controversy, and it really polarized the community into two groups: the scientists who've never been able to show using reduction of science that Savory's system has worked, and then those producers, and not all producers, but some producers that feel that they like the idea that you can increase stocking rates and grazing capacity, and make more money from the land. So I I'm not an exponent of the exponent. Is that the right word? I'm not a fan of the savory system, and neither are most of my rangeland colleagues in Australia, and I know that in the US and Africa, it's highly contested. And one of the reasons was that Savory developed his system in South Africa, where rainfall is regular. You know what's going to happen next month. You can plan. But when you're in a system that we have in Australia, where rainfall is highly, highly variable, the coefficient of variation, the variability in rainfall is is quite high. So you can't really plan what's going to happen in 6 months' time. Um, you've got to take advantage of opportunities that arise. If it's a big rainfall year, you might put on more livestock. If it's a low rainfall year, you take off livestock. Um, so a system that's based on moving livestock around, which might work in Africa, is not very effective in Australia. And that's one of the issues of Savory. And when Savory's questioned over this, he says, oh, you didn't move the livestock quick enough. Oh, you've got the wrong size paddock. Oh, you didn't use water enough. Oh, you didn't do this, you didn't do that. It's very difficult to use typical reductionist science to disprove some of the claims that he's made.
If we throw out the work that he's done, just for the sake of conversation, and you take your knowledge of what you've looked at for the past 30, 40 years in Australia, a place like that, a brittle landscape, irregular rainfall, if you wanted to regenerate drylands, but there has to be, let's say there was an economic incentive to get somebody to do this. So somebody's got to graze animals on here that they can sell at the end of the day to make it work, versus the government just saying, hey, we'll just do it this way and we'll fund you and cost is no object. So if somebody had an economic model to work to regenerate a dry land, how would you go about doing so?
Well, people have actually done this already. There are a number of very innovative young pastoralists or ranchers in Australia that have done this. And their technique is really, well, first of all, they're generally fairly well educated. They've got a university degree. That's not to say that if you need a university degree to do this, but they embrace technology. They're always looking at climate models to try and predict what's happening. They're very computer literate, and these folk basically work on the proposition that low risk stocking, in other words, reducing the number of livestock you run on the land, ends up giving you a better long-term productivity because you're maximizing the value that you get from the land rather than maximizing the value that you get from the livestock. So I can remember a Rangelands conference 20 years ago when this fellow got up and showed his data over the last 20 years where there were huge droughts. And because he was reduced, because his carrying capacity, no, not the carrying capacity, his livestock, the number of livestock he was running was something like 20% fewer than adjoining pastoralists. He was able to, his production was fairly constant. It was moving up and down a little bit compared to his neighbors who were living in a boom and bust scenario. And the expression boom and bust is often used to describe the Australian landscape. We go from huge rainfall years, last 3 or 4 years, we've just moved out of one now, and we're moving into probably another bust. So landholders that are working in this boom and bust environment really fall into two camps. They're either putting on a lot of livestock when there's a lot of grass, or they're maintaining a steady number of livestock over time. So you're asking me how I would go about restoring these systems. I think there's definitely a place for livestock in restoration because they do a lot of great stuff. You've just got to manage the numbers. You've also got to control feral herbivores. Now, this is highly contentious again, and we have kangaroos in Australia, which are, I guess an analog or similar to what you might have in other countries like wild ungulates. And they're very efficient at breeding and they're very efficient at removing biomass. So most graziers, pastoralists will, excuse me, need to manage wild herbivores as well as managing domestic herbivores. What can I say about
Well, will a
grazing management?
wild herbivore retard the system from advancing? Because there's just
Really
no.
high during droughts and in really high densities, yes, they will. But in average years, no. Um, so we found uh, we were involved in. I was involved in a huge grazing study at 450 sites over a large area of Eastern Australia, and we found that kangaroos had no effect on soil health. They had no effect on pastoral production. They had no effect on reducing fire risk. They basically were quite benign in this landscape. Excuse me. Um, the problems you get with feral herbivores is when you overgraze with livestock, and then livestock are competing with kangaroos and or rabbits, and that's when you get into trouble. So if you're managing, if you're running livestock, if you're running sustainable levels of livestock grazing, and that usually means less than fewer livestock than what the system can take, then you've got grass that will recover much more quickly. You're not destroying the structure of the soil. You've got a more resilient system that's likely to bounce back after drought. And that's been proven by a number of these innovative young pastoralists, particularly in Western Australia.
Yeah, one thing I found particularly interesting, and Dr. Rosentretter talked about this, is the sub or surface things like lichens on the soil of these
Mm,
lands are
mm.
really adding a big boost that most people pay no attention to. They walk over it, they don't notice, they're grazing on it, they don't notice it's there. And I know you've looked at this a lot. When you look at organisms on the soil surface, how much of an effect do they have in a system like this?
Um, they have a big effect, and Roger Rosentretter is completely right. They do lots of interesting things. So in Australia, for example, there's a big study now looking at cyanobacteria on the soil. Most people don't see cyanobacteria. Blue-green algae is the name for cyanobacteria. And we often think of blue-green algae as being bad because it's in our water systems and it produces nitrogen and all that sort of stuff. But in the soil, it's fantastic. It's pumping out a lot of nitrogen. And what we find is that in Northern Australia, for example, where they use fire quite frequently, the traditional owners used fire to manage herbivores, to the Australian Aborigines. Um, but pastoralists use fire to manage the vegetation, to get a nice green pick. Um, if you burn too frequently, then you destroy the cyanobacteria. If you burn, and I can't remember the actual details, it might be a spring burn every 2 or 3 years. There's a recipe that they've been working on. Then not only do you get rid of uh, old grass and rejuvenate the pasture, but you also encourage the cyanobacteria, and that's pumping lots of nitrogen into the soil. So in the northern part of Australia, in the summer rainfall, high rainfall landscape, cyanobacteria are critically important. You use the term brittle. It's a term that we don't use. It's a savory term. It's the first time I saw it was when Alan Savory wrote about it. But in southern Australia, in the Mediterranean landscapes, our soils are covered in a very rich crust community dominated by lichens and mosses, and also cyanobacteria and other things like diatoms and bacteria and eukaryotes and stuff. Other things like that. Excuse me. These soils are very fragile, but the crust provides a very stable surface. Think about it like the icing on the cake, or the crust on the bread. It's providing a hard surface that prevents wind and water erosion. Now, okay, when we find crusts, we often don't find vascular plants growing. Now, is that because they're stopping vascular plants growing, or are they growing where vascular plants don't really grow that much? So our experience is that in degraded systems, these crusts come back. They're the primary colonizers. They're coming back and stabilizing the system. Eventually, you'll get grasses coming in. Grasses will overtop the crust. The crust can't compete with low levels of light. Vascular plants take up the moisture. The crust disappears. So it's this kind of ebb and flow. And it's quite a dynamic system that when vascular plants uh, go, crusts tend to become more dominant and vice versa. So in answer to your question, they're critically important. They're critically important all over the world. And this is one of the problems with the holistic resource management doctrine, that they say that you've got to break up that brittle crust because you need to, because it's halting succession is the term that the HM people use. And maybe the crust is stopping infiltration, but what it's doing is it's moving water from a particular area down to another area. So it's helping to move water around in the system. They're critically important.
How much of a role does that crust play on what's happening below the surface? So that crust is alive, it's feeding microbes below the surface, which are then doing work to pave the way for future succession.
I think the crust is having a big effect. It's not really my area of work, but I know that people are looking at linkages between crusts and mycorrhizal fungi and plants, and there are some very strong linkages. And I know that beneath the crust, we get higher levels of not only nitrogen and carbon, but we get manganese and copper and different trace elements. So clearly the crust is nurturing the soil beneath it. When you lose the crust, you lose that tiny topsoil layer that has most of the carbon and most of the nitrogen, most of the trace elements. So it has to be having an important role in what's happening below the soil.
When you look at the impact of herbivores in these systems, wild or domestic, there's a lot of things they're doing. They're pruning the grass, they're distributing nutrients through their manure and urine, they're trampling some down, creating some surface mulch. If you could pin it down, obviously they're doing a lot of things, but if you could pin it down to one of the most important things they're doing, what is it?
You mean important things for
To keep the
sustaining?
health of the grassland or
Okay.
rangeland.
Yeah, the health of the rangeland. I think their biggest effect is herbivory. So they have two main effects, as you say. They have a herbivory effect, they're removing pasture, but they have what we call an engineering effect. And that engineering effect is generally disturbing the soil, cutting the grass, moving stuff around. It's a what we'd call a non-trophic effect. They're not consuming stuff, but they're changing it. I I've never really thought about the relative. I've never really come to a decision about the relative importance of both those processes. I'm more interested in the engineering effect because I'm more interested in soils, soil health, soil stability, landscape function, stuff like that. But I think that removal of vegetation is critically important, and I think that's probably their biggest role. So when they're removing the plants, they're not just indiscriminately taking plants. They're coming along and they're taking the nicest bits of the plant, the nutrient-rich ends of the grasses, and they're helping to change the balance between above ground and below ground processes. And that's critically important. And we know that herbivores in the Serengeti, for example, the removal of all that top grass or some of that top grass does fantastic things to the roots. It enhances root growth and enhances carbon in the soil. So I suspect that the biggest effect that they're having in productive grassland systems is through herbivory. But if we're talking about arid systems, systems that are, to use your term, brittle, then the biggest effect that herbivores are having, I believe, is on the soil surface. So, for example, in places like the Middle East, Palestine, Israel, there's 3,000 years of goat grazing and sheep grazing. And it's done two things. It's altered the vegetation composition from palatable perennial plants to fairly unpalatable shrubs that have recalcitrant chemicals, things that herbivores don't really like to eat. But it's also changed the soil surface dramatically. And that soil surface has now gone over a threshold where it'll never be the same again. And we could probably say the same for Australia, large areas of Australia. We've lost that topsoil. We're down to a more impenetrable, harder subsoil. And a lot of that's got to do with the movement of animals, the movement of hooves on the soil. So I guess I haven't really answered your question, but I think it depends what sort of system you're in. If we're in a beautiful grassland in Wyoming, then animal movement's probably not that important in my view. It's probably the herbivory, the grass production. But if we're looking at in the Middle East, in Egypt, in wherever, Saudi Arabia, it's the disturbance to the soil that's probably the most important.
What about, below the soil, some of the work that's being done there by different macrofauna? I know you've done some work on ants and termites and some of the work that they do to engineer the subsoil. What's been the most mind-opening thing you've learned about that?
I think all of these macroinvertebrates, ants, termites, slaters, all those sorts of things, they're doing a couple of things. One of the things is that they're breaking down organic matter and making it available for fungi, bacteria, microbes. But the other thing that they're doing, which is to me is fascinating, is that they're creating pores in the soil. They're creating these little channels, these pipes. And what that does is it's linking the soil surface with the subsurface. So they're putting oxygen into the soil. Now, we know that when we grab a bit of soil, 50% is oxygen, 25% is minerals, and 25% is water. So you got a quarter water, a quarter minerals, but 50% air. It's critically important that you get air into the soil. And one of the things that livestock do, if they're poorly managed, is that they trample the soil and they push out all those pores. They reduce the porosity or they increase the density of the soil. They get rid of all that air. You need that air. Along come ants and termites, digging little holes, burrows, and there's lots of other things too that dig holes and burrows. Your big things. In the Snake River plain in the US, you've got ground squirrels and badgers digging holes, and they're having a huge effect. You've got in northern China, on the Tibetan Plateau, you have pikas and zokas doing exactly the same thing. They're building tunnels into the soil. Now, what do those tunnels do? They get air into the soil, but they also get water into the soil. And that's critically important because it provides a pipeline for moving water into the soil, which the subsoil needs. But it also prevents the loss of water from the surface. So instead of us losing in drylands all that water when it runs across the surface, it gets caught in these little tunnels and little pipelines and gets into the soil. So it's preventing erosion and it's enhancing soil function. So these guys are pretty damn important.
Yeah, it's always interesting looking at some of the I don't know what material they use, but they'll pour things into some of these termite mounds or holes or ant holes and essentially make a cast of it
Yeah.
and then dig it out. And they're enormously elaborate for such a tiny insect to have something that can be 10 feet tall when you bring it above ground and see it in front of you is like, wow, all these little things built at it. It's pretty mind opening.
Well, there's an amazing photo that uh, and I can't remember the guy's name now. He sent me the photo for a book chapter that I wrote. And he worked on harvester ants in the US. I can't remember where it was. Might have been in the Midwest. And he poured a substance into their nest and then excavated it. And then there's a photo of him standing up next to a cast of this nest, and it's taller than he is. It's huge with all these anastomosing channels, and it's just insane. And those harvester ants are having a huge impact on the soil, as well as bringing material down into the subsoil, of course.
Yeah, it's, between them and the organisms on the surface, like the lichens. I mean, they're performing all these functions that
Mm,
people take for granted.
yeah, that's
I know,
right.
I know a lot of the work that you've done involves the encroachment of woody species
Mm.
into grasslands. Before we kind of dig into that, is is nature's plan for grasslands to evolve into forest? I think people think succession and think, okay, well, grassland comes before forest and it goes there, and it's just the grasslands build up enough soil, eventually woody things come in. Or are there just some grasslands that are always meant to be grasslands?
Oh, wow. What a great question. I think a lot of the succession stuff, which is it's not really. Oh gosh, since Clements in the 30s, we always thought that, okay, the grassland goes to a shrubland, the shrubland grows to a forest. If you wait around long enough, it'll happen. Um, I don't believe that. It's obvious. It's obvious that there's a whole bunch of communities that are fairly stable. Okay, they're moving, but they're kind of pretty stable. They're always staying a grassland, always staying a forest, whatever. And you have all these perturbations. You have fire and then high levels, high rainfall years, and the boundaries change. There's some incursions, and there's a fire, and the boundary reestablishes. So I think that there are these fairly stable systems. The issue with encroachment is that the system's out of whack. There's high levels of CO2 in the atmosphere, and I mean, you'd have to you would have to have been on another planet over the last 20 years to not understand about the CO2 levels in the atmosphere. So in a high in a on a planet with high concentrations of CO2, shrubs have a competitive advantage over grasses. This is not really my field, but I know that the photosynthetic pathways of shrubs are really advantaged by high levels of CO2. Sorry, not shrubs, woody plants. So as CO2 increases, then it's much easier for shrubs to increase, to develop, and it's much more difficult for grasses in general, some types of grasses. So we have this, okay, so we have this CO2 in the atmosphere, but that's not the only driver. We have these other drivers. We're looking at a legacy of overgrazing, maybe 100, 200, 300 years ago. Think about the Jornada in New Mexico, where livestock would move from south to north hundreds of years ago, eating out all those beautiful grasslands and disturbing the soil. Now it's a shrubland, and it's pretty much locked into being a shrubland. So you've got the legacy of overgrazing. You've got increasing CO2. You've got a reduction in fire. Australians, humans are paranoid about fire. Most of us, except traditional peoples that use fire. But most European-based peoples want to control fire. So those natural fire cycles that would have gone through and re-established grasslands, burnt the shrubs, kept that boundary clean, they've now been disrupted. And to add on to all of that, we've got rid of top-down predators, the wolf in the US, the dingo in Australia, other predators in South Africa. And there's emerging evidence that these predators are really important for providing an indirect uh, suppression of shrublands by protecting small rodents that forage for seeds. So there's a little bit out of my area of expertise, but I have been involved with some folks that have shown that when you remove top predators, you disadvantage those small rodents that eat the seeds of shrubs. And shrubs, then there are more seeds, there's more germination, there's more regeneration of shrubs. So with more CO2, less top-down predation of some top predators, um, changing rainfall and overgrazing, we've set up this scenario that shrubs are likely to increase. So, and and I think actually that's probably not a bad thing because shrubs sequester CO2. So it's kind of a way that Earth is fighting back. That's the way I kind of tend to look at it. They're pumping out more biomass, they're sucking up more CO2, and maybe they're going to contribute to reducing CO2 levels eventually in the atmosphere. Um, anyway,
This is a bit of a philosophical question playing off that. I think when people think of things going away, they associate that's bad. Grasslands going away, that's bad. Shrubs come in, hey, there's more CO2. They're using CO2. They're sequestering that carbon, getting it out of the atmosphere. That's a positive. Is there a reason we'd want those grasslands to go back into grasslands from
absolute,
shrublands?
absolutely. And I think this is where we really have to think about where are those prime grasslands that we don't want to convert to shrublands. And many people are doing this already. We have a whole suite of shrubland obligate species, birds, reptiles, carnivores, mammals, whatever. And if we lose our grasslands, not only do we lose all of these species, but um, we lose the productive potential that these grasslands bring for pastoralism. The Eurasian steppe in northern China goes right through Russia, right through China, all the way across the top. That is one of the most productive landscapes in terms of pastoralism, and it feeds billions of people. But they're having a big issue with the invasion now of shrubs, a particular shrub called carragana, which is a native shrub, but it's kind of taking over the grassland. And it's a big concern in China and Russia and other places um, that shrubs like this will reduce our grassland. So we need to try and maintain the integrity of the grasslands that we've got now. And maybe that doesn't mean going in and removing shrubs because that's been shown globally to be extremely ineffective, both ecologically and financially. But really by understanding more about grasslands and what they need. So in Europe, for example, they realize that what grasslands need to sustain them is to reintroduce some type of herbivores. So they're reintroducing some types of cattle and horses that are really critical in these systems and that have been lost, for hundreds of years. This is happening particularly in places like Sweden and well, in Scandinavian countries anyway, and also in the UK. So the reintroduction of animals that are critical for maintaining grasslands is one of the things that we can probably do. And also reinstating fire. Fire is critically important in grasslands too. So we need to get away from the mindset that fire's bad and it's going to eat all of our pasture and think about it as being just another tool in the toolbox for managing and sustaining grasslands.
Is the idea behind fire, wildfire comes through, it burns out the shrub, it burns out the grass too, but the grass can recover faster than the shrub and outcompete it then?
Yeah, I guess that's the central kind of premise of the use of fire. Um, Grass will recover a lot more quickly, but the conundrum that we have here, and this is particularly evident in Australia, and in the first 10 years of my working life, I spent most of my time killing shrubs, trying to work out how to kill shrubs for landholders, for pastoralists. And the last 10 years, I've been spent trying to work out how to save shrubs. So it's kind of, I've come full circle. But the idea is that fire burns the grass and provides a fuel to burn the shrubs. Now, we have many systems all over the world where the density of shrubs is so dense that there is no grass. There's no fuel. You can't burn the shrubs. That system is pretty much locked up until maybe you get a very, very, very exceptional 1 in 1,000 year rainfall event that just produces all this grass, and then you can burn it. But then most producers aren't prepared to burn it because it's kind of like burning money in the bank, because that's what sustains their livestock.
Say finance isn't an object. You said money is a big constraint here. If there's a bunch of shrubland that used to be grassland, I go through, I take out all the shrubs, physically, humans do it. Why won't that go back into grassland?
Difficult to know. It's possible you can do that. It depends on the system. Then we would be concerned about the soil seed bank, because these shrubs produce a lot of seed. So it would be a matter of maintaining shrub control for many years afterwards. I suspect that with shrublands comes a change in the soil surface and a change in the biota that are associated with shrublands. So maybe we're going to lose some of our grassland invertebrates that are really important for getting water below the soil, for breaking up the organic matter, producing nutrients. So it could be that the system just moves into a new stable state that makes it very, very difficult to change. I'm just trying to, off the top of my head, I'm just trying to think of a system where I know that has been highly successful. The only systems I can think of are where you have mixed grassland, shrubland, and people have successfully removed shrubs from a grassland in an early stage or a moderate stage of encroachment, using chemicals that don't disturb the soil surface, that just kill the shrubs. But if money were no object, it would be possible, but it would be, I think recovery would be it'd be a long recovery process.
This might be chicken and the egg. Does the above ground biomass control what's going on below ground and lead that, or vice versa? So if I have a grassland, does that dictate what fungi, bacteria, organisms are in the soil? So when shrubs try and come in, they're not adapted? Or is it, hey, the grass is growing there because the bacteria and such below the soil have provided the ideal conditions for the grass to grow?
I think it's a bit of both. In fact, I've seen some papers that showing how these models work, and they've often got a double-headed arrow between below ground and above ground, because clearly grasses provide substrate for microbes. So microbes are depending on grasses. Grasses are depending on microbial decomposition and all that sort of stuff to feed the roots. So it's a little bit of both. We know that if you look at the microbial communities in shrublands, they're very different in some respects to the microbial communities in grasslands. So there are different taxa that we lose, or that we gain in another. But whether or not there's some complementarity, whether or not, the notion that there's not just one microbe that does one job, there's a whole bunch of them. And if you lose one, well, then others take over. whether that complementarity is sufficient to, to feed the new system, I guess yeah, I don't really know. I couldn't comment on that.
Yeah, here's another wild card then for you. Do the microorganisms in the soil provide any sort of defense for the system for having another species to come in? I mean, you have a two-way transaction, right? The
Yeah,
bacteria are
yeah,
benefiting from the grass. They want the grass to stay because I want
mm,
what the grass is putting out. If
mm,
shrubs come in, grass goes away, I die. So in theory, I need to outcompete the stuff that shrubs would like, that would pair with shrubs, and maybe I make stuff that shrubs don't like, oh, I don't like that soil, this bacteria is in there, it's no good. Is there any evidence of that?
yeah. There is. There's a whole lot of evidence that shows that bacteria are critical for germination of plant seeds. In fact, we've done an experiment here, and we published it a couple of years ago, where we sterilized soil and we got a whole lot of different plant seeds and we germinated them in the laboratory with with bacteria from soils, different soils, from degraded soils and from healthy soils. Degraded in a sense that it had been overgrazed for 150 years, and healthy soils, very functional soils, functional soil processes. And what we found was that the seeds are responding to the bacteria, the microbial community that they're inoculated with. And I mean, it makes sense. There are some bacteria that are really important for eating away the seed coat of particular seeds that allows them to emerge, to germinate. There are other bacteria which are important for sterilizing fungi around seeds that might eat the seeds and, consume them. So this is an amazing area of research. It's not my area, but reading through, when we wrote this paper, reading through some of these reviews about how important different bacteria are for different plant species, there's so much we don't know. I mean, think about orchids and about how we need particular bacteria for orchids to propagate. Um, it's yeah, it's mind blowing. So I think you're right. Getting back to the shrub grassland situation, if you just remove the shrubland and expect grasses to come back, then maybe the system isn't primed to accept those grasses. Maybe you need some grassland bacteria in there to help germinate the grassland seeds or to nurture the plants or whatever. But I'm sure there are ways around it and I'm sure you've seen in the literature, people, not in the literature, on YouTube and on other places where people are selling these microbial mixtures that are going to double your wheat yield or going to do this. And there'd be special microbes that help plants produce more nitrogen or produce more phosphorus or whatever. Um, and that's probably the reason why a lot of these shrubland removal studies haven't worked, because they don't have the right microbial community.
Yeah, I can't remember what you said, how much this is in your realm, but the concentration of CO2 in the air dictating shrubs versus grass, we can call that ratio. I mean, is some of this just we'll call it in God's hands? If that keeps going up, hey, shrubs are gonna just do better. We can't
Yeah,
necessarily we don't have a dial that we can easily turn to lower the CO2 in the air. And then eventually CO2 levels through natural cycles, on a geologic time scale, will go down. Grasslands come back because they can outcompete shrubs at lower CO2 levels.
exactly. And I mean, it's exactly how the biocrust grass mechanism works. It's ebbing back and forth. And you're right, as CO2 goes up, woody plants will have a competitive advantage. It's just they're just better able to produce biomass with more CO2. And we know that from all these free air carbon exchange, these FACE projects that are all over the world. You pump CO2 into the top of a tree growing in a big sort of cylinder, and it grows more. They just like it, more CO2. Um, so the problem is, though, that this is going to happen in geological time, not, and it'll be just a blip in Earth's history. But we're stuck here. We're stuck here in this period of rising CO2, of trying to maintain our dwindling grasslands. And maybe it's inevitable that we're not going to be able to do it.
Are we riding on the bus, or are we the ones driving that CO2 bus?
Ooh, well, if you talk to the conservation movement, they'd say that we are the drivers through fossil fuels, through all the things that humans do that are bad, that cause more CO2. Um, I don't know enough about the history of the the paleo history of previous high CO2 events on the planet, but um, I think we have to take a lot of responsibility for increased CO2 in the atmosphere. I mean, people were talking about this in the 60s and 70s, but nobody believed it. It wasn't an issue. And what I find quite scary, I mean, I find a few things scary. The fact that I've got a son and, he's going to have a family and they're going to be living through worse situations than I am. But the fact that I started working 40 years ago, and when I was working in rangelands, I've never seen those particular rangelands come anywhere near what they were like when I started working, even though we've had 4 years of huge rains. This the system has kind of moved. The system has moved in my lifetime, and that's pretty scary, in my lifetime, in my working lifetime, 40 years. And what's going to happen in the next 40 years? You know, um, it's it's probably going to be worse, but hopefully, we can all get our act together and reduce CO2. But there's this. It's like a train that doesn't have a driver, and okay, it's slowing down, but it's still got a lot of momentum, and it's gonna be a long time before CO2 levels start to come down.
And with that being in our control and out of our control, is it now a case of it is the state we're in? How can we preserve what we have given the changing state? Like, how can you keep the grasslands in this state? How can you enhance them through practices? Is that where the future is when you're seeing these grasslands change over the course of your 40-year career and they've never been the same? Is it, whoa, okay, this stuff can go one way and not go back, so we need to really act to halt, slow, uh, potentially reverse some of this damage?
I think I I think we've shown from in the literature that it's not impossible, but it's very, very difficult economically, so financially, and ecologically to revert to change a shrubland into a grassland. So what we have to do is to maintain what we've got now. And that's going to require more intensive management. It's going to require, smarter minds than mine about how you manage grazing, how you introduce new species, new types of herbivores to improve the condition of the grassland, to maybe bring back some of those functions that were lost 300 or 400 years ago, reinstating. I mean, one of the things that we're doing in Australia at the moment is to reinstating these semi-fossorial, excuse me, what we call semi-fossorial mammals. These are animals that live under the soil. They graze on the soil, but they dig little holes, and they're critically important for sustaining grasslands because they create a niche where plants can grow. They change the chemistry of the soil. Um, So reintroducing these animals into conservation reserves is critically important to maintain these grasslands and other systems. But you can't just release these animals. You've got to control their predators. So then there's this whole predator control issue. So controlling predators, reintroducing animals, making sure they're okay, changing levels of livestock grazing, introducing different types of herbivores. It's all part of a toolbox that we have to use to try and maintain grasslands.
When you look at some of the areas of Australia where you've worked over the course of your career, what does the future look like for some of those regions that have lapsed?
Uh, there are certainly some areas that have. Okay, let's take a step back. In the 1900s, we went through this huge, the early 1900s, from late 1890s, early 1900s. We went through this huge drought. Excuse me. It just devastated large areas of Australia. And remember, at this time, we were treating the Australian landscape like it was a European landscape. Stocking levels were probably 5 times higher. A lot of those perennial grasses were lost. A lot of topsoil was lost. But over the preceding 50, 100 years, things have improved. Some of these areas have regenerated. A lot of these areas have regenerated. We've learnt more about how to manage these systems using sustainable levels of grazing, removing grazing altogether, reinstating fire regimes, destroying, controlling feral herbivores like rabbits that are a major problem. So we've learned a lot, but there are still some areas where conditions are still pretty bad. And because we've lost so much topsoil, the structural integrity of the soil just is not going to, it's just not going to go back to what it was before. We can create a novel ecosystem, a system that has different species that's stable, maybe not the original species, maybe not the original assemblage of organisms that were there, but nonetheless a stable ecosystem. And you see these all around the world. Places like Switzerland, where you go to these agricultural landscapes and they've created these small fields where they've let the wildflowers come up, and it's stable. It's not exactly the same as it was before, but it's a very functional and productive system. So I think that's what we're kind of moving towards. We're moving towards maintaining the systems in the current health, but also, I won't use the word restoring, rehabilitating degraded systems so that they're novel, they're new, but they're pretty stable, and they do provide a whole bunch of ecosystem services, probably not as much as they would have in their original state.
Would you say that a lot of the same thoughts apply to annual agriculture systems that aren't grazing systems, but it's for things like wheat, corn, soy?
So I'm not exactly sure
In terms
exactly what you
of
mean.
like we've taken pasture, we've turned it into annual crops,
Mm.
and we're repeating that on a cycle that depends on a lot of outside inputs to keep it going, a lot of money to keep it going. Do we eventually end up at a point where that just doesn't work anymore because we've beat the system up so much?
I think,
Where is that an overgrazing analog in a way?
yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And what we've relied on with these agricultural systems is for technology to keep one step ahead. Okay, we've bred a new rice variety. Great. That's good. We've got a new wheat variety in drylands, which is shorter, doesn't need much water, as much water. but the yields are quite okay. We're able to grow legumes to enhance nitrogen. We're able to pump in lots of phosphorus. We can do all this stuff. I I think we're lucky that technology has helped us to kind of keep ahead of the game. But eventually we're going to run out. I think we're going to exhaust the bank. You can't keep adding artificial fertilizer. And I think this is the reason why this whole movement, I mean, I was going to say over the last 10 years, but it's just struck me that in the last 10 years, the people around me, similar folks working in similar industries, are all talking soil health, healthy soils, soil health, soil carbon. Everyone's talking. It's the mantra. And if you go and talk to a group of farmers and talk about soil health, they're engaged. 20 years ago, or 30 years ago, say, yeah, whatever, I mean, you would have been seen as being a little bit alternative, maybe a greenie. But now soil health, everyone wants to know about microbes. Everyone wants to know about what microbes are eating the stubble of my wheat, and should I burn it or should I incorporate it? If I incorporate it, I'm going to get nitrogen locked up by microbes. What should I do if I don't burn it? I'll get diseases, crop diseases. People are really engaged, and this is really refreshing. So we are kind of moving away from the old, if I can use the term, the Monsanto days, where we just used herbicide and killed everything. We're moving away from chemicals to a more holistic view of farming that includes managing microbes, managing ground cover, managing tillage. Try not to till the soil too much, because every time you do, you break up the structure. So we're moving away from that, and that's quite refreshing. So I don't think it's all doom and gloom in the farming industry, because remember, farming is producing a product that's got a value. So unlike rangelands, the value per hectare is probably much higher. So they can afford to do things that you can't afford to do in rangelands.
Soil health, regenerative ag. I mean, that's what people listening to this are into. Is there anything you've came across within your area of research or outside of it that has just blown you away? Like something that this could be recent or in the recent past where you saw it and you're like, whoa, I never would have guessed that. It was a paradigm shift. You always thought white and it's black. Does anything come to mind that fits in that category for you?
Not, not really, except some years ago, and I can't remember, maybe 10 years ago, I saw a program on our national public broadcaster in Australia. And it was about a guy who had a different view on weeds. And maybe some of your listeners might know who the person is. I can't remember. But what this, instead of going and spraying weeds, he was letting them grow. And he said, look, they're just part of the system, and they're producing organic matter. And that organic matter is going to break down and it's going to replenish my soils. And I don't care really if it's a terrible old thistle that my cow can't eat or whether it's a beautiful grass. I don't want to get rid of those weeds. So I suppose that was a big eye opener for me, that really the way we think about plants, this dichotomy between it's good and it's bad. There's no such thing as weed, non-weed. I mean, really, when we think about when I did ag science at university, a weed was called a plant out of place, which I think is a great concept. I tend to think of weeds, well, we tend to think of weeds as something that doesn't belong in Australia as a weed, something that doesn't belong in the US as a weed. Um, but if it's providing a function, like thistles producing nitrogen, um, or if it's producing macropores in the soil, or if it's providing material to break down to create decomposable nutrients, then fantastic. And this this guy who was just a farmer saw this and realized that maintaining all these weeds was maintaining his ground cover, um, and he got less erosion. He got more infiltration into the soil. His soils were much damper and much wetter. That meant that he was able to have livestock longer into a dry period without destocking. It was a win-win. So weeds are good.
No, I like it. I think a lot of people share that view. What about this one? Is there anything that if you knew the answer to this, it would solve or answer so many questions you've had in your research throughout the years? Is there like one soil mystery, like if you had the secret book of the earth and you could look and find the answer to, what would it be?
I wish I could answer that question. I don't think there is. I don't think
There's
there
no
is
white
one.
whale out there for you that, you're
No, there's
chasing.
no. I, I, I'm interested in, as a scientist, I'm interested in lots of things. I always was as a kid. I wanted to look at everything. I wanted to look at the bugs, the birds, the soil, and all that sort of stuff. So I don't have, like, I'm not on a trajectory to find the Holy Grail. I'm just kind of moving from place to place. And I got interested in biological crusts. You talked to Roger Rosentreater recently. He's a big proponent of biological crusts. I got interested in biological crusts in a random moment that my boss asked me to find out why this landscape was eroding and why something else wasn't. And then I discovered all these lichens on the soil. And then I kind of moved into crusts. And I got interested in soil disturbing animals because somebody said, "Hey, these little guys are digging up your crust." And I went, "Oh, that must be bad." And then I got involved in shrubs because I was a bird watcher, and it seemed to me that shrublands were really productive because there were lots of birds, and I couldn't understand why people wanted to kill them. So I've kind of moved around in my career, sort of almost as the river took me, and so I don't. So in answer to your question, I haven't really got one thing in mind. I mean, some scientists do. I went to an ecological society meeting last year, and a guy was given an award, and he talked about his 40-year search to work out how to save one particular plant. And he's done some great things. He's looked at its germination. He's looked at what happens with climate change. He's looked at soils, and he's the man. He's the man for that plant. But that's not me. I mean, I'm probably a bit too. I can't sit down for that long and focus that much on one particular thing.
Me too, me either. Putting it all in place, it's almost like, you see in those shrublands that are so productive, it's, hey, a shrub is just a tree in the wrong place, right? It's the
Exactly.
weed, it's the woody weed.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Well, in Australia, they're still called woody weeds. Well, they're woody. They're weeds, I guess, from my agriculture days in the 70s. Yeah, sure. They're not meant to be there. Well, they are. They're natives. So they're meant to be there. There's just too many of them. Um, uh, and then the government coined the term invasive native scrub. So it's native, yet it's invasive. So I don't understand the logic of all that. But anyway,
It's
it
invasive
was really
to
just
economic
yeah.
interests.
Yeah, well, it was just exactly. It was just an excuse. Call it something bad. Call them terrorists, and then you can go in and kill them. So, it's the same sort of thing.
No, absolutely. And I want to really thank you for coming on to share your thoughts today. I really appreciate it. Is there anything you're working on now that you're really excited about looking in the future?
Um, do you know what? This is probably not like soil. Well, it kind of is soil related, but I fi I find that people ask me stuff, and I've got a lot of stuff to give, and I really enjoy teaching, and I really enjoy writing. So what I'm doing at the moment is running writing courses for students, how to write scientific papers, because it's a black box for a lot of people. I wish I had someone who took me under my wing when I first started writing. My first paper, I know it took me about a year to write. It was terrible. Looking back on it, it's a terrible, terrible paper. Um, but it was so frustrating trying to learn how to write in a scientific style. So I'm doing a lot of workshops with students and academics, teaching them how to write, and so it's so fulfilling. It's just wonderful, but it's not necessarily soily. So I love editing, I love writing, and that's where I see the next few years of my career going.